The Sahara Desert, a vast sea of sand and rock, it has long divided North Africa from the lands to the south. But for centuries it was also a highway. Caravans crossed from oasis to oasis carrying gold, salt and ideas. Yet this highway also bore a darker cargo, enslaved people, forced across the sands in a brutal trade. The Sahara's story is one of connection, suffering, and resilience, etched into the very sand. When most people hear the words African slave trade, their minds immediately turn to the Atlantic. We think of European ships crossing the ocean, of vast plantations in the Americas, and of a brutal system that lasted for 400 years. This is the history that has been most extensively documented and is most prominent in our collective memory. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific chapter in world history, and its scale was immense. It forcibly transported over 12 million Africans across the ocean, with devastating consequences that are still felt today. This narrative, while critically important, has often overshadowed other older systems of slavery connected to the African continent. The story of Africa's enslavement is not limited to the Atlantic Ocean. Long before European ships arrived on the West African coast, another slave trade was already well established and thriving. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade was a system of a different kind, but it was just as devastating. Lasting for more than 12 centuries, from the 7th century well into the early 20th century, it was one of the longest and most sustained slave trades in human history. It carved deep wounds into the heart of Africa, yet it remains a hidden history for many. It is a story that has been whispered in the shadow of the Atlantic trade, often overlooked in classrooms and public discussions about slavery. This video will shine a light on this forgotten history. We will explore the origins, the mechanics, and the profound effects of the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade. Our goal is to understand how this system operated and the lasting legacy it left on African societies. We will investigate who was enslaved, why they were captured, and what their lives were like. This is not simply a matter of correcting the historical record. Acknowledging this trade is essential for a complete understanding of both African and global history. It reveals a more complex picture of the continent's past, one that involves intricate relationships between African, Arab, and Berber peoples. By examining the Trans-Saharan trade, we can begin to appreciate the full scope of Africa's suffering and resilience. It challenges the simple narrative of European colonizers as the sole perpetrators of the slave trade on the continent. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the roles different societies played in this human tragedy. This exploration is not meant to diminish the horrors of the Atlantic trade, but to broaden our understanding. We must recognize that Africa endured not one, but multiple overlapping slave trades that bled the continent of its people for well over a millennium. Long before the Trans-Saharan slave trade, the Sahara was a place of connection and commerce. Traders crossed its harsh terrain, exchanging gold from the south for salt from the north. The Berber and Tuareg peoples mastered these routes, using horses and oxen before camels revolutionized travel. Early trade included gold, salt, ivory, and cloth, and even the first captives, foreshadowing the darker chapters to come. With the rise of Islamic empires in the 7th century, North Africa was unified under a new political and religious order, transforming the Trans-Saharan trade. Cities like Cairo, Tunis, and Fez flourished, demanding luxury goods and labor. The demand for enslaved people soared, fueling a vast, organized trade. Sahelian empires like Ghana and Mali became key intermediaries, trading captives for horses, weapons, and goods. The Trans-Saharan slave trade became central to the region's economy, shaping societies for centuries. The Trans-Saharan slave trade was justified through a mix of religious law and economic motives. Islamic law allowed the enslavement of non-Muslims, while African societies often saw slavery as a result of warfare. Regions south of the Sahel, like Lake Chad and Darfur, became major raiding grounds. Enslaved people were sent north to cities like Marrakesh and Cairo, and even further across the Mediterranean and Middle East. Their lives were scattered, their ties to home lost in the vast Sahara. Who is enslaved? The answer: the vulnerable, those outside the dominant faith, ethnicity, or power structure. Non-Muslim communities on the fringes of Sahelian empires were prime targets, seen as outsiders and thus fair game for enslavement. Raids were systematic, often state-sponsored, with cavalry armies overwhelming villages to capture, not kill, healthy young men, women, and children. Warfare between African states also produced captives, turning prisoners of war into valuable trade assets and fueling a vicious cycle of conflict. Tribute and kidnapping further fed the trade, with weaker states forced to supply people as a form of tax. The process always began with violence. Families torn apart, communities shattered. Enslavement was not random, it was institutionalized, driven by political ambition and economic gain. The human cost was immense. Lives uprooted, societies destabilized, and generations condemned to bondage. Vulnerability, defined by faith, geography, and power, determined who would be marched north in chains. The machinery of the trade was relentless, reducing people to mere commodities. Capture was only the beginning. The Sahara crossing was a brutal ordeal. Chained together, captives marched for hundreds of miles under a merciless sun, with water and food strictly rationed. Many perished from exhaustion, disease, or dehydration. Those who fell behind were left to die, their bones marking the desert trails. The Sahara was both a highway and a graveyard, claiming countless lives. Major routes, Timbuktu to Morocco, Lake Chad to Tripoli, Nubia to Egypt, each posed unique dangers, but all were defined by suffering. Caravans, sometimes thousands strong, moved alongside camels and goods, led by guides who alone knew the way. The mortality rate was staggering. For every survivor, many more were lost to the sands. The journey stripped captives of hope, leaving only the strongest to reach the markets of the north. The desert crossing was a test of endurance few survived, a silent testament to the scale of human tragedy. Every route told the same story: forced migration, unimaginable hardship, and loss. The Trans-Saharan trade was a business, human lives reduced to market value. Northern merchants exchanged horses, weapons, textiles, and salt for captives, fueling a cycle of violence and dependency. The price of a person depended on age, gender, health, and skills. Young women and boys fetched the highest prices for domestic service, concubinage, or military use. Eunuchs, created through brutal castration, were especially valuable but rare due to high mortality. Market towns like Timbuktu and Gao became centers of negotiation, where survival meant being sold to the highest bidder. The demand for luxury goods and military power drove the trade, turning people into currency. Every transaction was a cold calculation, lives weighed against horses, cloth, or salt. The economic logic was ruthless. The tools of enslavement were bought with the very people they would subjugate. The market dictated fate, sealing destinies with a handshake and a price. In the end, humanity was lost to profit. Surviving the desert meant a new life of servitude in North Africa or the Middle East. Most women became domestic servants or concubines, their lives and bodies controlled by their owners. Men were forced into military service, mining, or agriculture, dangerous, grueling work with little hope of freedom. Eunuchs created through mutilation served as guards or administrators, their influence bought at a terrible cost. The trade supplied labor for every sector: homes, fields, mines, and armies, integrating slavery into daily life for over a millennium. Children born to enslaved women could sometimes gain freedom, but their mothers remained in bondage. The system endured for centuries, shaping societies on both sides of the desert. For generations, fear of raids and capture haunted sub-Saharan communities. The machinery of enslavement became a permanent, devastating feature of life. Every survivor carried the scars of violence, loss, and forced labor. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade drained sub-Saharan Africa of millions over 12 centuries. High mortality during raids and desert crossings meant countless more lives lost than recorded. Unlike the Atlantic trade, this system targeted women and children, crippling communities' ability to recover and grow. Certain regions, Lake Chad, Niger Bend, Ethiopian highlands, became perpetual hunting grounds, suffering repeated depopulation. The loss of the young and able-bodied stunted economic and social development, leaving societies weakened and vulnerable. Aggressor states grew rich, while slave-supplying zones were left scarred and underdeveloped. The demographic wound festered for generations, with fewer hands to farm, innovate, or raise families. The cycle of raids, loss, and instability made recovery nearly impossible. The legacy of the trade was not just in numbers, but in the enduring trauma and stagnation it left behind. The scars of this human tragedy are still felt in the affected regions today. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade reshaped Africa's economy, bringing wealth to Sahel empires, but at a devastating cost. Rulers traded captives for horses, weapons, and goods, fueling a cycle of raids and warfare. The economy became dependent on capturing and selling people, stifling agriculture and crafts. For many, survival replaced prosperity. This legacy of extraction and disruption shaped the region for centuries. The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade shaped the rise and fall of Sahelian empires, fueling power and conflict. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and Kanem-Bornu all profited, building armies and expanding through warfare and raiding. This reliance on slave raiding led to endemic warfare and instability. States became threats to their own people, using armies and administrators to capture and sell captives. The state was seen as a predator, not a protector, a legacy that echoes in the region today. The Trans-Saharan slave trade left deep scars on African societies, unraveling their social fabric and creating a climate of fear and distrust. Communities lived in constant alert, afraid to work, travel, or trust even their neighbors. Social bonds broke down, families were separated, and knowledge was lost as millions were forced to migrate. The loss of culture and identity was incalculable, leaving behind a void that could never be fully refilled. The Trans-Saharan slave trade left a deep and lasting legacy across Africa. Centuries of depopulation and trauma shaped societies, fueling underdevelopment and distrust. Old wounds and divisions still echo in modern conflicts and politics. Yet, African communities have shown remarkable resilience, forging unity and preserving culture. Understanding this legacy reveals both the roots of today's challenges and the enduring strength of Africa's peoples. To truly grasp Africa's ordeal, we must compare the Trans-Saharan and Transatlantic slave trades. The Trans-Saharan trade lasted over 1,000 years, moving millions, mostly women and children, to North Africa and the Middle East. The Atlantic trade, shorter but more intense, forced over 12 million Africans, mainly men, across the ocean to the Americas. The result? Distinct diaspora communities in the Americas, while in North Africa, assimilation was more common. Both trades shaped destinies, but in profoundly different ways. The Trans-Saharan and Transatlantic slave trades, though different, shared a brutal core: the dehumanization of millions. Africans were stripped of names, families, and freedom, reduced to property, bought and sold for profit. Both trades inflicted unimaginable suffering and forced migration on a massive scale. The trauma and loss echo through generations, leaving scars on Africa and its diaspora. Recognizing both histories is essential to understanding the roots of today's inequalities and the resilience of those who endured. The Trans-Saharan slave trade carved deep wounds into Africa for over 1,000 years, moving millions and reshaping societies. Yet this immense history is often forgotten, overshadowed by the Atlantic trade in Western memory. The silence is a profound injustice to those whose suffering has been marginalized. We must bring the story of the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade out from the shadows, honoring its victims and remembering its impact. Remembering the Trans-Saharan Slave Trade is not about dwelling on the past but understanding the present. Its legacy shapes today's challenges and the resilience of African communities. Honoring the victims restores dignity to those whose stories were lost to the desert sands. Their endurance is a testament to the unbreakable will to live and the power of cultural memory. Let us remember, learn, and honor the profound resilience of the African peoples.